Good afternoon, everyone. Hello, this is Do More Together, and this is our Black History Month series. We are going to dive deep into who we are. We talked about our place in history last year, but we really want to expound on who we are and what got us there. Today, we are just so blessed and proud to have Ron Steptoe with us, class of 1987. He is currently the CEO of Warrior Centric Health, which is training healthcare providers to provide veterans with world-class care. And I am just super proud that you are here with us, and I'm going to give you a minute to introduce yourself and jump right into your story.
Well, thank you so much. I appreciate the opportunity to be with you, Tasha, here today. And one of the things that I think is critically important is that you're doing this series. Like you said, our stories are so varied, right? And so unique, but we don't get a chance to hear them from ourselves, our friends, our neighbors, our roommates, right? And we're sometimes surprised when we hear these stories. And we need to stop being surprised by them. We need to share them, because if we don't share them, especially with mediums like this, how is that history going to be passed on? So thank you. First of all, I wanted to say that and do more together. So yes, I'm Ron Steptoe, class of 87. My wife, Lisa Steptoe, is interesting. 5 years coming out of the academy, I was still Ron, the basketball player. Everybody knew me. 5 years after then, people said, Steptoe, I know that name. I say, yes, I'm Lisa's husband. They go, oh yeah. So we're definitely seen as one. But I'm just very excited to share my family's story and history. It's one that has been captured, believe it or not, in the history books, but I wasn't able to really pull it together. And I'll tell a little bit more about that story. It took me several years to pull it together, but I think folks will find it an interesting our place in history. All right, so Tasha, again, thank you so much for allowing me this opportunity to share. As I mentioned before to you, that I've shared this will be the fourth time. First time was the Defense Information School at Fort Meade for their Black History Month 2 years ago. I had the pleasure of being asked to give the Black History talk for the 1st Stryker Brigade out of Combat Stryker Brigade out of Alaska. My class asked me to give a bit of the history, and I'm just very, very excited to now finally have an opportunity to share with Do More together. So one of the things that I like to start off with is that this is, first of all, an American story. That's, I think, a critical part for us to see, particularly as African Americans. A lot of times it is as if our history is somehow separated, bifurcated from America. And I think that when you hear the story of my family, you'll see, yes, this is an American story where the characters happen to be Black and African American. So again, it's a story of family. It's a story of country. It's a story of commitment. Commitment to mission, commitment to the country, commitment to self, commitment to America. But let me talk a little bit about where my folks are from. They're from a place called Nesmith County, Virginia. It's now known as Suffolk, Virginia. You see me on one of the little dirt roads, and I was real small. Okay, my family, my mother and father moved up to the Washington, D.C. area. So I would go back to the country from the city of Washington, D.C. Every summer and spend my time there. If you know anything about Nesmith County in Virginia, swamps and peanuts. Okay, that's basically what you got. Okay, and so, but it's a real interesting area, the Tidewater area in the Suffolk, Portsmouth area. I had the pleasure of attending a Catholic military school in Washington, D.C. called St. John's College High School. And in fact, I think the folks in the team today will appreciate that this was the first JROTC high school in America. St. John's College High School out of DC. And that year, again, about 4 of us had an opportunity to go to the academies. 3, including myself, went to West Point. And one, John Sniffen here went to the Naval Academy. Who, anyway, John was my teammate on the basketball team, and so I had a chance to get us play ball in the DC area, but also head off to West Point. So I bring us to our West Point years, where many folks are very familiar with myself and with Lisa, and this is me on the parade ground leading the new cadets during the Beast Barracks year. And obviously you see me here once I had left the academy and went in to be with my unit at the 177th Field Artillery Battalion, part of the 94th Armored Brigade at Fort Knox, Kentucky. So let's talk a little bit about the memories and the family history. The individual you see here is actually Henry Henry Elliott. And Henry Elliott is my grandmother's father. He will come back into play in a bit at his point in history. But I will just say to you that his grandfather was James Bowser IV. And so let's wind back now from Henry Elliott. Let's go back in time. One of the things I'll share with you before we go back in time, just to connect me a little more directly to the Bowser family in West Point. When I had an opportunity to obviously get my appointment to the academy, one of the things that was very interesting was that the Bowser family at a family reunion actually provided and gave me a certificate for attending the academy. I didn't understand at the time why this was such a big deal to the family, that I would be granted a certificate, if you will, of achievement, but I would soon find out many, many decades later why this was such a critical moment for the Bowser family and for me as we look back on American history. So as we go back, before I really get us back into the revolutionary time, if you will, I do have to take an opportunity to speak to really someone would consider the father of Afro-American studies, if you will, in America, and that's Carter G. Woodson, who actually started the Association for the Study of African-American Life and History that he founded in 1915. What was interesting is in that the 1980s, there was an interest in actually creating an African-American kit that would be something that would share how an African-American family could trace their roots back to colonial days. And my family, the Bowser family, was selected as that family by the Association for the Study of African-American Life and History as the family that they will look at modeling for the African-American Tracing Your Family's Roots kit. And my grandmother, my mom's mom, was central in this document that was produced in 1981. So let's go back to the Revolutionary War. Very different time as we look at the 1776 through 1782. America was at threat. The British were really wreaking havoc up and down the East Coast, really trying to punch a hole and secure the ground, and they really had a hold in the New York area, and they then made a move south. Now you can see that they entered in through the South Carolina, Georgia area, got a foothold there fairly quickly, started moving up into North Carolina, and was approaching, as you can see, North Carolina, moving into the Virginia area. But as they really got to the North Carolina area, my grandfather, James Bowser I, and there's also James Bowser II, had enlisted in 1777 to actually be in part of the fight in the Pennsylvania area. He then got out and then re-upped as they saw the British coming towards Virginia. This would have been in 1780 that he re-upped. Now, interesting enough, he was a free African-American man, which we'll get back to a little bit later, and 50 years old. So in September of 1780, he re-enlisted, and as you all may be familiar, the Battle of Yorktown took place in October of 1781. And that's when we defeated the British. We took Cornwallis out, the British General Cornwallis out. Interesting enough, in January 1st of 1782, James Bowser II enlisted at the age of 19 and was really part of the cleanup crew as we escorted the British on their way. And so I'll talk a little bit more about them as it relates to that in a few seconds, but I really wanted to set the stage to let folks know that as America was fighting for their freedom, fighting for our freedom, that there are about 5,000 African Americans that actually participated in the Army as well as the Navy. And both my fifth great grandfather and fourth great grandfather were two of those free Blacks that were part of that fight. And at the time, probably about 1% of the population of African Americans were free at that particular time. Now, interesting enough, you would sit back and say, wow, they were free. So, good on them as it relates to fighting for America. But what people don't know was that they had a big choice to make, because at the time, the King's Royal Governor in Virginia was John Murray, and he was the Scottish Earl of Dunmore. And he offered slaves, as you can see, freedmen and indentured servants, okay, basically anybody that was a Negro, if you will, saying, look, you need to come on our side and fight for the British, because if you don't, when we win, you will be a slave. In fact, we will kill you. So it wasn't a given on which side to actually go to at that particular time. But both James Bowser the first and second decided to fight on behalf of America. A gamble, didn't know where this was going to go. Okay. Now, with that being said, here again is part of Virginia Humanities and History and the Encyclopedia of Virginia, where you see the story. Again, joining the military, 1777, 1778, first skirmishes up in the Pennsylvania area, and then again at the siege of Yorktown. Now, what's interesting, as I said before, there was a decision to be made on whether or not the fight for what would be America or the fight for the British. Now, because we defeated the British, the Blacks that did go on the side of the British, and there were many, that's where you see a lot of folks that are based in Canada now, or went back to the British with the British. They left with the British and sent them on their way. Fortunately, my folks were part of being on the ground and staying in the Virginia area. So for their service, they were each awarded the nation's first veterans benefit, which was 200 acres of land. So interesting enough, as privates, both of them got 200 acres of land. Don't want to talk about what the colonels and all those folks got, thousands of acres, if you will. America was for the having, unfortunately, at the detriment of our Native American brothers and sisters. With that being said, though, their families were free from that point on because they were already free. And interesting enough, they were landowners and they were free businessmen in America. So at that time, America at least recognized their service. And it creates a unique situation as we go through history, if you will. Now, one of the things I will say, and we'll come back to this in a few seconds, when you look at James Bowser the first, again, the key thing about being in the military and having property, we could trace the records. That's why we're able to be able to do this, because it also shows the power of property, right? And the power of being in the service. We can trace these records back because America actually keeps those records. But if you note, he was a free mulatto, so of mixed race. We'll come back a little bit to that as a part of the story in the bit as we talk about mixed race and mulattoes at that particular time. Now, in fact, we'll go to that now, because one of the things I think is important to share in that is that America has always been a melting pot, contrary to what some other folks may want to say about America. Let me give you an example. So there's a lot of debate about 1619. Is it this? Is it that? It's not this, it's not that. Well, let me tell you what it is for my family. Okay. There's a group of people, first of all, when the first slaves arrived, well, let's say the first Africans, if you will, arrived in 1619. A little bit of the backdrop, okay, of that story is that the Portuguese were obviously ravaging Angola. If you ever look at the map of South America and Africa, you'll see that they right there at Angola, Brazil and Angola go right there. Okay. Anyway, just the point. It's one of the shortest points. Okay, to get to South America. And so, as the Portuguese were sending slaves directly into not only Brazil but also making their way to the northern part of South America, moving into the Caribbean and into Mexico. One of the things that was happening is that the colonies, okay, in the early 1600s were first being settled by the Virginia Company. Now, the challenge is the system of slavery wasn't fully in place at that particular time. So when tobacco started really to take off in Europe, the indentured servants they brought over here weren't enough to address the needs of that cash crop. So one of the things that the administrators of the Virginia Company, going against what the King George of England had actually said they should do, is actually sent pirates out to go pirate the ships. And that's how the first Africans came here, because they were actually pirated. Okay. And when they pirated the ship, pulled those 19 off, that pirate ship came back to get resupplied and dropped them off for exchange of goods. So what was their status when they actually arrived here? Slavery really wasn't in place yet. Okay, so what you had is they really were here as more indentured servants,
Right.
okay, than they were as slaves. And so what you find is that Africans, okay, that came here coming from Angola, there was this term called the Malungo. And Malungo, interestingly, same connotation in Brazil as well, means those who traveled together or traveled by sea. Now, interesting enough, you'll see that Malungo term in a few seconds will come to bear. But when their indentured servitude was over, who, especially since they're mostly men, they married the English or the Indian women that were here, and actually created this mixed race group of people that many people are not familiar with, which are called Melungeons. I'll talk to you about that in a few seconds. So
From Appalachia.
Say again?
In Appalachia.
Exactly, and we'll talk about that in a few seconds as well, right? So if you look at Anthony Bowser, okay, who is my forefather, again, born about 1650, actually got his freedom from Major Gunnell Bennett when he passed away. And at that time in America, you actually could get your freedom if you petitioned from your indentured servitude. Okay, so basically 800 pounds of tobacco per year is what he had to do. But you can see we have the records of actually being able to show back to that particular time. And so this group of mixed race people, okay, were, as slavery started to become ingrained in the late part of the 1600s, what you saw is these individuals started to say, wait a second, we need to get up out of here. And they started to move west, okay, into Western Virginia, in reference to the west part of Virginia, and into Appalachia. So you'll hear people sit back and make some comments about Elvis Presley and Abraham Lincoln and a whole bunch of other things. What people don't know is that they're descendants of Melungeons. Mm-hmm. Now, my people actually stayed right there in that area. They did not move. And for all that was to come of them not moving. So we talk about, again, the mulatto, James Bowser IV. we get to see a bit where that's coming from. The point I want to make was more than anything else, we were here from the beginning. Who were the people that were the descendants of those 20 individuals and the ones that would come after? Who were those people? And we're considered the last lost tribe in America. Sitting right there, and there's a history there. So when people debate 1619, why don't you come talk to me?
But this points out why it's so important that we tell these stories, because the reason why they're lost is because the stories weren't told. And because your family has a history of military service and land ownership, as you were saying, there's a paper trail so that later those descendants can come back and find out what happened. But without those documentation, you would be lost. You would have no clue that this is your history.
And it's our history. So interesting enough, when we talk about the 5,000 individuals that have served, a lot served on behalf of their masters, right? Who, when the service was over, the master didn't hold up to their service. So this is a story not just about my family. This is our family stories. For those individuals, they weren't there by themselves.
You're correct.
We just have the documentation. So this story is your story. It is your family's story. Because one of your family members were serving with them and experiencing this with them. So I really want people to know that I am really, one of the reasons I debated about telling the story. I debated about, because some people like what they hear, some people may not like what they hear. I actually have very positive reactions. What I hear mostly from our Caucasian brothers and sisters is, I had no idea. What I hear from African Americans, I knew it. I knew it. I knew it was there. Okay, so it's a mixed bag story. So bringing it home back to again Henry Elliott, and just give you a little bit of family tree, and I'll kind of tie this together in a bit because we'll get to the Civil War and how that plays, because it gets to become a bit of a dark time. Okay, but just wanted to show you again Henry, my grandma Anna. This is again, they had 11 children, okay, and in fact, Uncle Henry William Elliott actually served as well. And you see, this is my grandma right here. My grandma was critical to that piece I showed you that was developed with Irma Thompson that would be tracing our history back. And that book that I showed you before at the very beginning, one of the interesting things about that story is that things I'm telling you guys about right now, I didn't even understand to my grandmother hand when she passed away. She asked my mom to give me that book. And interesting, that book sat downstairs in my basement, not even in my office, for 15 years. I knew none of this information because I never opened the book. One day I was down in the office and I brought upstairs to my office, and it sat in my office for another 5 years as a decorative piece. It wasn't until one day I'm sitting in my office, and guys, have anybody seen the movie Jumanji? Have you ever seen the movie Jumanji, right?
The book opened?
That's right. You hear this boom, 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 boom. Hand on heart. I heard boom, 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 boom. And I was like, what is that noise? Boom, 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 boom. What is that noise? And I literally, this thing sat in my basement for 15 years. It sat in my office for 5 years. I go and I open the book and I start looking through it, and I see that document from the Carter G. Woodson organization that my grandma right here was the critical family member that worked with the historians to trace this all the way back as a published piece of work that was sitting in that book. that would open up everything I'm telling you about. It was all documented, and my grandma would do it. And my mom says, Ron, grandma knew one day you would open the book and tell our family's history from this part. She did her part. Now it's your turn. So I feel compelled to that. And this is my mom and my mom and dad. So now there's a question at hand. And there's a question at hand, okay, because I mentioned James Bowser, or if you will, James Bowser IV, and I'll talk about that in a few seconds. But again, James Bowser IV, which would be Henry Elliott's grandfather, okay? His children, so remember, we've got this land, right? Civil War's coming. It's here. They've got to walk around with freedom papers, all 10 of his kids saying, don't pick us up, we're not slaves. Because he's a landowner, business owner, farming, selling potatoes up in New York, and a horseman, all this other stuff. Landowner. So he's not in the land gentry, but he also is not a slave. But his people, his children, have to walk around with these freedom papers saying, don't pick us up, we're not slaves. Wow. Think about that. And the interesting thing is that bothered him. It bothered him because he says, you know what? If I'm free, but other people aren't free, my freedom is suspect. They could come get me. Okay. So he decided, because, some folks in the slave community looked at him a little slant, a certain way. White folks looked at him a certain way. So they literally were this isolate. Okay. So he decided that he was going to become a Union intelligence officer, a spy. Now it's interesting. James Bowser I had a decision to make. Do I go with the British or do I go with America? James Bowser IV had to make a decision. Do I shut my mouth and just hang out here? I'm good. My people good. Or do I go with the Union? Another decision point. Well, he made a decision to go with the Union and put everything on the line. And in doing so, we enter the dark period. It's the dark period because for 150 years, I wouldn't know what happened to him. The family wouldn't talk about him. Why wouldn't they talk about him? They wouldn't talk about him because what I found out in 2013, after continuing doing this Google search, is how my grandfather really died. See, my grandmother wrote in the piece that James Bowser died by flogging because some Southerners weren't happy with him being a landowner. What she didn't say in the document, and what I had to find out through CBS News, Associated Press, when they were actually looking at slaves and honoring the slaves and spies of the South, was that my grandfather was listed as one of the 7 or 8 people that were these spies. Harriet Tubman was one. Barry Bowser, who was the person that worked in the Jefferson Confederate White House, had a photographic memory, not related. My grandfather was the example of what happened when the spy got caught. Because, yeah, they pulled him out of the house. Yeah, they flogged him. But they beheaded him on that property we got during the Revolutionary War as a land grant for our service to this nation. And his son was with him. And they're going to cut his head off too. But decided we need to use him as an example. So he had to run home to tell who would be my grandfather, my great-grandfather, my mother's father's mother, one of the 10 kids, that daddy's head is gone and they had to bury him and never speak him again because they were landowners. How could they acknowledge him? For 150 years. So we talk about the trauma. We talk about the history. It's one of pride and pain in America for African Americans, people of color. It just is. We find a way to survive and do the things that we need to do. But again, this is our history. We have been here. We have fought in every conflict, every battle. And I hope that today's story is just a way to share a bit of that with you. I share this here just to connect this back to now my work in here today, talking now about racial disparities, talking about our service members, our veterans. There's another fight ahead. The fight is not over. There's justice still what we need to fight for. And it's always been the veterans that actually have come together to take a stand against injustice in America, if you ever really look back at it. We've always been at the tip of the spear. And one of the areas that Lisa and I have focused on, tip of the spear, is for our veteran community, be you Black or white. Because again, many of us remember the Walter Reed scandal and what happened there. So our company, Centric Health, works on focusing on those particular areas as you talked about again. But it's about service to the nation. We're always serving. And so I appreciate the opportunity to share with you all today our story. And one thing I like to leave with you, again, it's a story of freedom. It's a story of responsibility. And it's a story of respect. And I hope what I have done today by sharing this story is do a few things. Number one, honor our place in history as a people. Number two, giving you something that you can hold on to, a story you can hold on to. And last but not least, I like to say to James Bowser first, James Bowser second, and without question, James Bowser the fourth. Be thou at peace.
But I wanted to talk back about like your family members. Like what was your family's story about James Bowser the first and James Bowser the second? Like what was the narrative that was passed down in your family?
That's just it. Other than no, so the narrative, let me tell you what I do remember. I remember there's always a Bowser family reunion.
Yeah.
I do remember going to that. I do know that the Bowers in our families are very respected in their community. Mm-hmm. I knew that our family had a good name in the community, and it was something I needed to live up to. Boy, don't you go out here and act a fool.
Right. Understand.
Okay? So there was a standard, but I didn't really understand what was behind that standing in the community, and that's what I remember as being a kid going down and visiting, and that you have a place here. There's a level of respect that you need to have, not to kowtow or anything like that. And interesting enough, what was interesting for me is being from the city, going down to Virginia. Like you said, you crossed that Potomac back in the day. Mm-hmm. Don't get past a little bit of Richmond. Things change.
Right.
And I remember back in the 70s or so, even my grandfather at that time, when we drive somewhere, here's this older gentleman to a younger person. Yes, sir. Yes, ma'am. I mean, I just begin to remember that because that's the environment that they were in, the deferential nature of the South, that I was able to lay eyes on that.
Was that the reason why your mom and dad moved to DC?
I think they moved to DC at the time because it was a place, it was an opportunity. They were 18 and 19 when they moved out. That's where the opportunities were, part of the migration, north into the city. I don't think it was necessarily that, but it was just interesting going back because a lot of us don't. maybe not have the experience of the vestiges, if you will, of the South or near things that people are experiencing today as you're going to maybe deeper parts of the South. But for me, I just remember, okay, a bit that a younger white person, as opposed to my grandfather being sir, and that it was the other way around.
Right. And there's a point you talked about when you talked about James Bowser the Fourth, and that he was an intelligence officer and he was murdered on his own land. But your family didn't talk about it out of family preservation. And I think that's kind of like, as the generations grow, like we don't realize that sense of preservation, like a lot of things happen that, hey, there's a young white man, a young white boy, he's going to be called sir, but he has to be called sir so that I don't get beheaded on my own land.
Yeah, and what's the psychology of that goes through, and you sit back in reference to our place in America. I constantly have to work through in my mind my place of where I'm at today. I constantly have to work around always trying to prove, as my chairman says, Ron, you don't have to prove anything more, okay? But I'm constantly fighting with, is it good enough? When some of our counterparts can just go and project into the world and the world accepts it as is. That's a constant psychological battle for me.
Mm-hmm. And
That's
what are you doing? What are you doing to combat that? Or process that? Maybe you don't combat it. Maybe you're just processing it.
Realizing that organization working with now, Kaiser had this interesting program to put together on business owners getting together to address issues of stress and mental health and stuff. And I realized that maybe I need therapy or something like that, because I think we don't realize how much stuff we are processing and dealing with, and how does it, impact us, even though we're striving and thriving and doing all of that stuff. And especially with the climate of America today. I mean, just look at some of the threads you have amongst your own class back and forth. It's really interesting in my class, especially since we're on the line. I'll leave it at that.
Right. Yeah. And so that, as we were talking about veterans health, there is a point I think we made maybe 2 summits ago that the VA is now looking at racial, like racism, as a factor in the mental health disparities for African Americans and Latinos specifically. So people of color, but specifically African Americans and Latino folks, because that racism that they experience in the service compounds the other trauma that everybody experiences, well, not everybody, but that many people experience in the service. And so it's a real thing. Racial trauma is real, and we do have to acknowledge it. And so as you're developing training and stuff, let's make sure that we link in with the psychologists and psychiatrists who are doing that research and that work, because there's not enough of those groups.
Well, the initial foundation of actually our first research we did look at is the difference in PTSD with veterans from the Vietnam era. And what we found was that a lot of the reasons is that many Latino and African Americans were on the front lines when they were sent directly there. And so the experience that they had, also the sense of, now I'm here and these people are brown just like me. So you got all these different elements that it actually became the basis of when we really started to look at disparities and things. We've obviously branched out much broader than that. But that was some of the very initial research that we looked at.
Yeah, awesome. And so I just wanted to say that in case we haven't explicitly said that racial trauma is trauma, and it does have an effect. And it is something that we should address in our therapies. And it's hard, and I'm saying this from personal experience, to address that when you have other things. Like if you've been to war and you have PTSD and you're like, well, nobody's killing me they're just talking bad to me, or I just had a bad experience at work, and you try to downplay what that is. But the racial trauma builds up because it's something that you're going to deal with. If it's at work, you're dealing with this every day. Right. If your livelihood in your business and your dream is tied to whether people see you as valuable and your work as valuable, and they don't, just because of the color of your skin or some implicit bias that they have, right, then it's like that eats away at you. So you do have to address it. So I don't want us to like gloss over it, right, because we have to address these things.
Well, it's a prime example right now, the things that I have to, ask question. Are you not funded because of this or because of that, and a whole bunch of other things? Those are all still very much things that eat at your psyche and are residual effects that we have to figure out. We manage through, but at what cost?
Right. So in your family's history, so you have a family history of service, and this is Revolutionary War, Civil War, Vietnam?
Yes. Uncles of Vietnam, Korea, World War II as well.
So in your family history, how was your family able to deal with the stress of going to war and serving and under the conditions that still exist in America? So
interesting enough, one uncle that I can know, one of my mother's brothers, again, I'll be respectful of names, once he came back from Vietnam, wasn't right. Something was good man, incredible man, yeah, loving man, but
changed.
Okay. Another uncle as well. Something about the service, the pride of pay, and they love the service. They didn't say anything about it. The family is very proud of it, but something changed. And so, that I know. Again, I think we really didn't talk that much. I mean, I think one thing about my mom was really critical about, I'm going to call it protecting me, but always saying that I could do. When people were telling me no, like it was time to go to the private school when I was in school. And sometimes we put limitations on ourselves. It was really an inner city school in Washington, D.C. And the folks said, oh, he can't make it go into now this majority school. And that my mama said, don't tell me my boy can't do. Now, where did that come from? My mom. Okay. Mm-hmm. My mom decided, as opposed to going to get her college degree, that she would make sure her kids got educated. So she paid for us to go to private school, and I would go work with her during overtime when she was at the FDA to do those types of things and the sacrifice. My dad's income, took care of the household and things that we need to get done, and then sending me to this private parochial school, in upper north and upper northwest. I will say this one thing I do remember with now that teacher saying, well, he can't make it. I went into the school thinking, okay, can or can I not? But interesting enough, in religion class, it was a Catholic school, I remember sitting down and I remember getting my paper back and I got an A. And the guy next to me, my Caucasian colleagues, got an F. And I thought to myself, that was the moment in time that I said, oh, they're no smarter than me. And it was game on. So one, we got to get an environment. Two, we got to have an opportunity to perform, because what I realized was there were systems in place, even amongst our own folks, saying what we can and cannot do or can and cannot be.
Absolutely. And it's sad that it continues today. And this was like last 2 years ago, talking to a cadet, and she was like, we need more people to go talk to our guidance counselors, because my guidance counselor swore up and down that I could not get into West Point. And there she was at West Point succeeding. And it's like, well, who told you? Like, you don't know what it takes to get into West Point. Like, who told you that she couldn't do it? And so
it's interesting you bring that up. So the story, again, even my high school, love my high school, awesome. But again, a counselor, to be named nameless, same thing. Well, Ron, you're more apt and I know history HBCU is great, but when we talk about West Point, now, by the way, I'm like one of the top students there. I'm the second in command, 1st Battalion, basketball all-star, student body class president, was vice president, excuse me, was president since I was in the 7th grade. But yet I'm the one in the picture that I showed you that the counselor said when they were, no, he can't go. So it was a big stink. Okay. And he never wrote the recommendation. He wrote the letter saying, I shouldn't attend. The coaches got in, well, what the heck is this? The president of the school and the ROTC commander, the president had to write my recommendation overriding him. The coach at the time, Legend, was like, you know what? Y'all keep messing around. I'm quitting over this. It was crazy. It was actually, he stated in the Washington Post too. Okay, a little bit later when after he retired, when they did a feature on him, and I had a chance to share in that. But it got to a point where it was going to go to the Post, and my mom would say, "You all lost your mind." Okay, so all the way, it's a fight. But I think it goes back to who's there in your corner. That when the world is telling you no, someone's sitting back and supporting you, saying, "You're not going to get this one." This one can do, and gonna go fight for you.
Let that be part of our legacy, that the people that come behind us can say that we were there to protect them.
Exactly. And that's what Do More Together is about. Why I got started, right? As you think about the initial thoughts of this being put together, when what we saw a lot of things going on, going back to making sure that we're protecting not only the cadets, but also our alumni, and for the benefit of the institution and the nation.
Do you think that your service, your going to West Point or joining the military, would have changed if you knew the whole story?
That's an interesting question that I never really thought about, right? I never really thought about that. So you give me a second with that. I don't know. I'll tell you what I do know. Okay. As someone said, Ron, this was your destiny. You were called to this. It was supposed to be, because I was a very good basketball player in the Washington, D.C. area. I was one of the top ones, right? But if you weren't from West Point, Naval Academy, or VMI, I tore up your letter. I didn't talk to you. Where's that come from? Who knows that at 18? Who knows that?
Right.
There were some rumblings about, Revolutionary War, but what I did know is that my mom and my folks always told me, you can do anything you want to. I never understood really why my grandmother was so proud of West Point. I mean, she beamed. I mean, she was like, "Oh boy, you done it. We made it. We continue on." And I never understood that my grandmother was the one in the family of all the Bowsers that had this story, and our line goes straight down to the military to now. I did not understand the connections that she saw and that she knew when that happened. And I wouldn't understand it until almost 20 years after her death. Something that sat in my office, that one day I opened it up, and all of what I'm telling you, just unfolded to me. And I'm sitting back going, oh my God, what is happening? And I will tell you, honestly, it shook me a little bit when I found this out, because I'm like, not what does this mean? But I was a bit of, if I can be transparent, guys, I was a bit afraid of the responsibility I now held in my hands. Because the question became, especially as America going through all of its turmoil and happening right now, when I'm actually an example, our family is an example that is a counter narrative for individuals that want to try to displace us from history. And I had to get comfortable with that responsibility.
Even when you didn't know the full story,
Right.
you were still walking in the path of your ancestors.
Wow.
And it's like we've been bringing that back. You know, we've been reclaiming the African tradition of honoring our ancestors in a more open way. But there's so many times where you don't even know how you're connected to your people. And you didn't know this whole story, but you were still walking in their footsteps.
Wow.
And as your grandmother said, we made it because she knew where your people came from, that because you were in Virginia. Virginia is where the Confederacy was based out of.
Right.
And so,
right. 3 counties south of the seat of the Confederacy.
Right. And so I'm going to, as a Virginian, for all the people who are saying Virginia's not the South, you have to understand that the capital of the Confederacy was in Virginia. Right. So this is very much the South. And especially at that time, and you have to, like, all the ports that were coming into Virginia. So like your family landed and became indentured servants, right, and became free. My family landed in Virginia sometime after and became enslaved. Right. And so you have to understand, like, so where your family grew up and where my family, you know, grew up, it, like, now by car it's an hour and a half, but it's Southern Virginia. Like, this is, you know, like the environment that was there in that time was very hostile. And your family probably saw it go from indifferent, or like even respect, to indifference, then to disdain. That's for right. African Americans, for Black folks, for Negroes, and they had to stand their own. And for your family to still own land that they were given at the Revolutionary War is amazing, because we know there's so many stories of land being stolen through all these different wars, being, you know, just appropriated by the troops, right, or, you know, taken over eminent domain by the government. Like, the fact that your family served, was able to take a stand, kept their land.
It's amazing. Now, here's one other part I didn't share in that story. So to mix this up just a little bit. So Sarah Bowser, interesting enough, was half Indian. Mm. Okay. So when her husband died, James Bowser IV, one of the things she did is, now the business owner owning the land, she wrote and had her will changed and the land records changed that the land could never be sold. She says, don't you ever, anybody, let this land go back to the white man. So was that Sarah, the Native American part, that got a piece of land back that was stolen from her people? Was it her understanding the African American experience, the Black experience, is understanding the power of land, or was it all of it?
All of it. It had to be. It had to be all of it, because then you would imagine being a Native American and the connection and stewardship that you have over the land, and then seeing how Negroes were treated at the time and not able to have land, or seeing land be squandered or land be stolen. She understood the importance of it and keeping that land.
It's interesting, Tasha, you bring that up. One of the things I didn't share, and that maybe not share, this is just part of us being able to talk now, right, was I started to understand now the power of land, because land gave you the capability to produce your own food. Mm-hmm. It gave you the ability to create a way of life. It gave you a way to transact in America.
Yeah.
And it gave you a freedom to be able to do that. So I'm really just beginning to appreciate the fact that, you know, we talk about generational wealth, right? And people sit back and go, oh, just pull yourself up by the bootstraps and all this type of stuff. I say, you know what? I said, let me explain something to you. Okay. Let's go back and let's use World War II. Okay. This is a lot of times I've had a colleague and a classmate of mine we were having a conversation, and he was saying, Caucasian classmate, he was talking about, Ron, let's understand, folks, we've, this is America, you can, do things. I said, wait a second. I said, let me ask you a question. Let's start from this basis. Can we agree that African Americans that served during World War II, that they were, when America was going through its expansion period, and we had benefits in reference to being able to get a loan, going to school, and all those things, that those African Americans deserved it just like anybody else that served? Came to agreement on that. I said, got it. Cool. That we agree on that. Now, what happens if, in fact, you have the right to be able to have that, but you got people that actually say that you can't have it, you can't buy in these neighborhoods, but your family can? So what do you think happens decades and decades and generations later when that wealth is being developed? We had the right to do it. We served our country, but you had systems in place. The question was about systemic racism. And at that point, he was like, oh my goodness, I never thought about it like that. Here, he understood, and we were parity as it relates to service, respected that, understood what would come with that, and could see now what happens when you have a kid today and you're asking me to pull myself up by my bootstraps, just go, systemic racism is over. And I said, but you don't even understand the impact of the legacy of it.
The trust gets eroded over time as the promises do not get kept.
That's a great point.
Right. So, and you can see how tides change by this institution of slavery, right? So if you were an indentured servant and you served, you were honored, you got your land, albeit not even the same amount of land as the white man.
That's
your
right.
family still got land, they're 40 acres and a mule,
right?
20 acres a piece, but so they got their land. But then if you were a descendant of a slave and you served, you did not get your land that you were promised. And that does have a legacy even today when we're talking about you trying to recruit Black folks and they're like, don't do it. My dad was enlisted and he darn near cried. And he was like, I hope that it's different for you because you're going to be an officer. But he, like, especially when my first deployment, he cried. And I was like, I didn't understand everything that he had been through. And this is the 80s. I didn't understand everything that he had been through and the reason why he didn't want that for me. But can you imagine this is all you see is like the promises being broken and you're sacrificing for the country and it's not given back. So it I don't know if it's willful ignorance, but it's like maybe it's if you don't have this experience or these touch points, you don't realize the effects that they have.
Can I share another? I've seen some things too recently, bring it home today, right? So Warrior Centric is a venture-backed company. We have investors, typical high growth tech company and all that stuff. But let me tell you what I've seen. I've seen the disparities. Let me explain. When I first started the company, friends and family were the majority of folks that made the investments. A lot of African Americans. At the point when we first got started, about 80% of our investors were African American. Today, it's about 30% because, again, as we've grown our pool, a lot more veterans have got involved. But I see the difference in the size of the check. It's unbelievable. Checks I'll get from African Americans, 10,000, 20,000, here and there, maybe a 50. I get $100,000 checks from other groups. I get 25. I see it. I literally, and there are people that want to participate, but they don't have the access to that capital, the legacy, whatever it took to build and to be able to do. There is definitely a difference, and I've been able to see it here. And that goes to the fact that less than 1% of African American founders get funded by the VC group. So I'm still fighting that issue, and we're one of. In fact, there was a study done recently by our Harlem Investment Group that actually stated that only 1% of Black and Latinx founders have raised over $1 million since 20, and up there was only about 250 to 300 companies that have done that since 2020. We're one of those. So we raised over $3 million So the question though is, so should I be happy about that or should I be absolutely disgusted? And I live in that
Well,
duality.
and you, and it would, but it would make you mad if you thought, okay, well, if we were a white-owned company, how much money would I have raised?
First of all,
Because the money.
first of all, let me be very clear. I've had people that are involved, okay, with our company. Okay. I want to be careful because of where this is. Let me just say that people very close to our company have said, Ron, you do know, based on what you're doing, you just covered a $300 billion market.
Uh-huh.
Okay, this whole story we can find that. He says, but you do know situations were different. You know, you've been funded. And that's a hard pill to swallow when you are just as competent. Some may say, if not more, diversity in businesses, are higher performing. But at this stage right now, my job is to be an example moving forward. And that's just a pill, unfortunately, I have to swallow. But let me tell you, it's a mind, you know what.
Absolutely. And so let's discuss that though, and not in the let's diving into the business aspect, but they call it resilience, but it's this determination, right? That you still have to keep going forward. You still have a mission, you still have goals, and you have an example of your family and how they kept going. Like, how do you think about your family when you're saying, okay, I know that I would be already funded, I know that I would be further along if situations were different, if either America was more equitable or I was not Black? How do you deal with the.
So early on, what I realized that I wind up having to do, and this has helped me very much, and I actually said it in an interview, it's a Black History Month piece that's coming out with Microsoft. As I said, interestingly enough, and I don't mean this in the context of crumbs for people that invested, but I mean, there were people that would go for investment. They wouldn't necessarily make the investment, but they would say, well, let me give you this little idea or just a little word of advice. They were helpful in the advice, I think a lot because I was a grad, okay? But they gave me a crumb. But what they did not know is that my people are master crumb cake makers. We've always had to take we always had to take the crumb, the piece of this and the piece of that, and create something new and fascinating that becomes the rage in America at some point. We've always been that group that created the new.
And you're absolutely correct. But I want to, one thing, say, we don't need more mentors. We need more money. So if you believe in us and our capability, the proven history, like in your field, there is not a competitor. So there should not be an excuse about why you're not getting funded. 2 years ago, somebody said this: what Black people need to do is to own our intellectual property.
Now that right there.
So I don't want to leave this interview without touching on that lesson that you learned about owning your intellectual property, so that because if you hadn't, this business would have already been replicated with somebody else and you would have been a footnote in history. So can you talk about how you knew to secure your intellectual property?
So a few things. One, I'm not here to sell any books, but let me tell you what was instrumental to me is Robert Kiyosaki. First of all, Cash Flow Quadrant, Rich Dad, Poor Dad. It was like, wow, somebody actually told us that what you think is how the world works, it's not how it works. And basically, this is how it's done and how they talk at the dinner table. And it was a textbook that I could study. So I was like, oh, okay. Then there was another book in the series. I read about 10 of his books, was Intellectual Property. It was a very technical book, but I realized the value of your mind and what you could do and how you protect it legally and the things that you put in place. So I realized that the value of IP, the value of intellectual property, and that really is the essence of what our company, before we got with Microsoft, we became IP experts. and protecting that and making sure the contracts are written right and a whole bunch of the things that we were able to do. Now, was that something that I was taught at the dinner table? What I do now know is that's dinner table conversation for people.
That's why we have to have this conversation. At least mention it and give somebody else the thought of, hey, let me go research this. Because a lot of the issues that we're having now, especially in businesses, and you see it a lot with the young kids on social media, the creativity of Black folks. Like, we'll create a dance, we'll create a song, we'll create a movement, a meme, a saying, but it's not, either they didn't know that they could, copyright, trademark their intellectual property, or when it goes to court, it gets denied.
Right.
Then, but this is the reason why one reason why we don't have a lot of wealth is because the things that we create are quickly stolen. This is why cultural appropriation is important, because it's not because somebody took it from you, it's because you don't get credit for it, because you don't get to reap the benefits of your own ideas.
And I appreciate, again, Robert Kiyosaki. Again, he's again mixed race himself for Asian American. So I was like, oh, I said he wrote the book and told the story, didn't he? But it was that book that I could get my hands on. So the secrets are in the book, and that's when I realized, again, the IP and get studied on it and was able to execute from there. But if I hadn't read that book, if I wasn't familiar with IP as a thing or something to protect, then you're right, we'd probably be in a very different situation.
Yeah, because I heard in your interview that you were saying, hey, in my contract with the government, there was a period of time where you were working for free, doing research and sharing with them, but you made sure that the contract stated that you still owned we own the very first contract I got with the government. And again, the money was there, but there was the opportunity, was not only all IP rights, all derivative IP rights worldwide. Right. See, let me just write that down for myself.
And when you have that basis, that protection, then it was ours to lose from that point forward.
Right.
As someone said, you make your money when you sign the paper. Now, what happens afterwards and how you take long and all the things you got to go through, another point that I picked up, again, not to sell Robert Kiyosaki, but these are thoughts. These are the dinner room conversations that were put in a book where he said, you make the money that you're trying to make in the contract. Okay. Now it's your job to work from there, but it's all the setup to the setup. So so you weren't a contracting officer. How did you do that? Did you have a lawyer look at it? Absolutely.
Or did you just...
Absolutely. I had the fortune of being involved in business. Again, one of my good friends from the civilian sector I went to got me connected with a brilliant lawyer, happened to be a business attorney. But I knew and studied enough on myself and just realized and worked through that. I would study. I had to study. I didn't. I had to have an idea of what I was getting into. But I spent a lot of money on attorneys and relationships before I even had my company and my business.
So these are key. So I would want to make sure that we're talking. There's two things that you said that have served your family well. One, keep the land. Two, protect your intellectual property. And so this is so I want to kind of like show a thread through history, because we say things like, hey, we've made progress. Like, your grandmother was very proud of you for making that progress by going to West Point, because your family's history went from we were enlisted to we were officers. And not only are we officers, we're going to the premier leadership academy in the world, right? So there's a progress there. But there's also a progress of we were indentured servants. We were free. We were business owners. We were landowners. we continue to be landowners. So even when there was a tragedy in your family had a means to support themselves and a place to go.
Very excellent point. Love you, Tasha. You're tying this stuff together. I appreciate being this. And I think one of the things that I'm learning now is that there are perspectives that we share that you're blessing me, because I see a dimension. I don't see all dimensions of the story, right?
Yeah.
And this is part of healing, right? There's still things
Yeah.
I have to swallow. There's still things I have to suck down to keep things moving, right? And as a military person, you know how to compartmentalize to do the things you have to do to be able to move forward. But it doesn't mean that the scars and the emotions, okay, aren't there. I remember one day I went to a dinner with a classmate of mine, love this classmate to death, with another African-American, one of my classmates. And one of the days, this person said, the African-American classmate said, well, you know, when I go to a particular town or something like that, I don't hang out, I do my job, I go and I go back to the hotel room. He says, well, why don't you just hang out with the folks? He says, no, because one person could say one thing when we're at the bar and I could lose everything because I'm the first in my family to be in this position. So I don't put myself there. And so the classmate said, wow, you have to think about that? He says, but you're a West Point grad. Well, why do you have to think about that? And he says, because I'm Black and American. And what was interesting, the next day I woke up and it hit me like a ton of bricks. You know, cool, it is what it is. But I said, wow, I actually wake up every morning in America, look in the mirror and go, I'm a Black man in America. And that has a connotation with it. Doesn't mean it holds me back one way or another, but I realized compared to my counterparts, they do not have to wake up with that on their mind, whatever that means and implies.
And it's a lot, but so here's a piece too. And I think it's something that you said about James Bowser the Fourth, and I'm trying to get the quote right, but it's if I'm free and others aren't, my freedom is suspect.
Yes.
And what that means for us now is if Black people are disenfranchised, it doesn't matter if I'm a West Point grad. Because when they see me, they see Black.
Right.
They don't see the lapel pin. They don't know that you're a West Point grad. And they don't see the ring. They don't treat you with the respect of that we, know that West Point grads get or veterans get or whatever these status symbols that we go after. They see that we're Black. And that's I don't want to say it's a hurdle, but what it does for me, and I think this is kind of like a thread in your family, is that it builds a character that you are like a change maker, and a chain breaker, right? Like you got to push through because you got to move us forward.
Right.
Because all of us got to go. All of us got to move forward, right? And some people can't. And if being a West Pointer can get us into some rooms, if it can get you $3 million, when you know that you should have already had $300 million, you keep pushing forward because you see it's moving the goalpost forward.
Can I share this one thing that helps me frame this to keep pushing forward, especially with the family history, right? So when I think about it, I said, these folks gave their lives, and Lisa and I are at a point where we also have to give our lives. We're just there now. That's the decision that we have made, as hard as it is, okay? That legacy exists here for what's right for America. But one of the things I also have to frame is realize that who are we to stop fighting when in fact, if it takes 200 years to move something out of a culture. And my class, the class of 87, was the class that was born in 1965. I'm the first class of people that were born on paper, really free in America. Okay.
On paper.
On paper. Okay. So let's say that 1964, 1965 is that starting point, and it takes 200 years to change something in your culture. We're only 56 years into a 200-year process. When I was born, it was T0. So who am I with everyone else that fought from a negative point 400 years to get to 1965? Think we've made it when that was T0. We have 140 something more years to go. So God willing, the next 30 years, what impact are Lisa and I making to pass the baton forward for the next 140-year fight? And when I realized that, I realized now what my role, what my goal, no different than Harriet Tubman, no different than the boys, any other the leaders, okay? There's a time and a place for us to continue to fight.
Keep fighting.
All right.
Keep fighting, because you, like, I don't know if you feel that you are kind of like a mentor or like a path maker for us that are coming behind, but you know, I'm looking at you, you know, because I'm like, okay, he's getting in the rooms and he's raising money. Okay, like, you figured out what you wanted to do and how you wanted to serve, and you know, like you said, we're coming from behind. This wasn't dinner table talk, but you're figuring it out. Hey, how can I make a difference? Where can I, you know, stake my claim? And Veterans Health is where you've decided to do that, and you're doing. But I also want us to, like, acknowledge, like, where we are and what we're doing, and highlight where we can continue. Like, so where you're passing the baton, okay, can I grab it from you? What are those things I need to get from you that I can grab so that I can move it forward too?
And with that being said, Taj, I appreciate that. Let me be very clear and come full circle. So I said the majority of folks that are investors in my group, and I want to be very clear and balanced here if I can. Okay. Our counterparts, our Caucasian brothers and sisters, okay, have stepped up to the plate. And again, I said, veterans are the people that come together to fight. They see, again, what we're doing. And so my largest and most investors have been Caucasian, as well as Caucasian veterans as a group. So I want to be very clear in this context that we have to demonstrate excellence. We have to demonstrate competency. And we may not get everybody's ear, but I think a privileged position we find ourselves in, and this question is, how do we leverage that, right, on behalf of the nation and everybody, is we're veterans, we're academy grads, we're Army officers, and that has its privilege in America. And the question is, how do we leverage that for all?
And I think that's what we're working on, right? It's like trying to figure out where we are. And I think that's an important thing when we talk about our place in history, right? We're all trying to figure that out. And Do More Together as an organization is, how do we leverage all of us and all of our talents to keep up that legacy of being leaders and change makers, not just in the military, but in the nation as a whole. And part of that is by telling the stories of where we come from, our lineage, telling the stories of who we are, and leaving those lessons for the people who are going to carry the torch after us.
Yes,
so,
absolutely. Absolutely.
And so what I want to kind of like close out with is a question from somebody who is not even in the academies yet, but we're trying to get her there. And then I'll ask you about some advice that you would give to somebody who's transitioning, and then I want to know who's mentoring you. So This question comes from Aria Taplin, and she wants to know how the Army has changed from your ancestors' time to your
So I
time.
think the Army, like any place or any organization, has been one of the places that have recognized institutionally that they need us. See, during the Revolutionary War, there was a period of time we can't have any black folks have any guns and stuff. No, we don't need y'all until it got down to the wire. Okay, why don't you all come on over here and help us out? So almost in every conflict, if you will, we haven't been wanted, but we have been needed. Okay, and so the Army, at least, is that organization, okay, that has realized over time the value. And I think that's why the Army you see leading in diversity, okay, as an organization, because in order for it to survive, for the nation to survive, it had to adapt. So I think if I can say anything right now about the military, specifically about the Army, specifically because that's where I have my experience, is that it has come to where the rubber has needed to meet the road. And at the end of the day, we've always showed up and delivered victory. Interesting enough, most people don't know that the man hours, okay, if you look at the man hours, only 5,000 African Americans actually participate in the Revolutionary War, yet there were 200,000 regular Army Navy folks and 100,000 militia for a total of 300,000. But 25% of the man hours came from those 5,000 people during their time. That's insane.
Very much so.
Okay, and so that's one of the things that I think that we have always done is stepped up. So I think from the military's perspective, it's an opportunity for us to be able to participate in America, for us to fight for our country, because we're the ones that have actually put the Constitution of America up to America's face and says you will abide by these letters that are written on this piece of paper. We're going to make you abide and make this paper real. We're the people that did that.
Absolutely.
Okay, and a lot of our veterans and the people in the military were the ones that came back to say we're going to make this paper real because I was willing to die for it. So today, serving in the Army and the military, it's moving forward. It gives you many, many, many advantages in America. It gives you many, many opportunities to be in the room. And we have to take that one step forward by being in the room. And so I think that the military has definitely evolved and it has changed. But, I think the key thing to say is that it's an opportunity for us to move not only the nation forward, our families forward, but it's always been a place where our people have moved forward. And for that, I give the military and the Army an immense amount of credit.
Amen. So what is the advice that you would give to those people who are transitioning from the Army? And that's the retirees. You've done your 20, 30 years and you're leaving all the way to the, hey, I just did 5 and I'm getting out. But I really would like to focus on those people who are retiring.
Right. So
because they've given their life to the Army and this is new.
Yeah, it's a whole different. I remember after, just the time that I was in the military, it took me about 3 years to adjust. But I think for right now, what's interesting is you've seen a very fast-paced environment. You've seen the world change. You have a tremendous amount of skills that you bring to the table. And I think, prior to, and by the way, the military has all different types of capabilities. And one thing that's happening right now, if we look at just from how I transitioned to be successful professionally, is that America doesn't have as many qualified people as it probably needs to have. You got extremely, I think, transferable and valuable skills. And the question is, how do you sell that to someone as a start? And so Lisa and I were very, very fortunate to work with a headhunter that I think can help you sell yourself, okay, to help you get started and realize that the first place you land may not be the place that you stay, Okay. But I think seeking out, and the thing is, we've got a lot of people. The one thing about the military is we wind up a lot of times being leaders wherever we go. So never discount yourself, whether you've been in 5 years, 10 years, 20 years, 30 years. Again, especially at West Point, when we think in general, we're here for a lifetime of service. Take that on. And the question is now, where you be leading and where you be serving as you go to your next institution that you will be blessing with your skill, your talent, and your knowledge. And be confident in that.
I think that's the hard part. That a lot of people aren't confident that their skills are transferable, that they are valuable, and that they can find a passion that's as big as the passion that you had for service to the military.
It's different. Your networks are different. Being close is different. It's a whole different space and time. So if I can, the value of do more together, still staying connected to the community. We didn't have this, Lisa and I, for many, many years. As you know, Lisa was one of the first people trying to pull us together in reference to the names and stuff that she put together. And then, you guys have moved it forward from there. But I think it's very, very important for us to still stay connected to our military community, at least socially, because you probably won't find something as connected and as deep unless you're involved in potentially a fraternity or a sorority or church. Okay. So I think those networks that you can stay together in, for me, it's the academy, is staying connected. And I stay connected also with the basketball team members that I played with and stuff. But we have to find those communities. And I think one thing about the military is our communities can be very much long lasting. They supersede time and space.
Right. That's the benefit of all your friends that you had at West Point and in the military, is that you haven't seen them in 15 years and you start talking like you never left. They don't hold it against you that they in 15 years.
Exactly. And with Facebook now, we can see what's happening with the kids and the grandkids anyway. So that's we're probably more connected than we were before.
Look, these poor kids, because I've seen so many of my friends' kids, and I'm like, hey, how you doing? And they're like, I do not know you.
Exactly, right? But I know you.
Right. I know everything that you've been doing. I've seen you grow up over the computer.
Exactly.
And so the last question is, who is mentoring you?
That's a good question. I think we're always seeking out mentors. I'm extremely blessed to have a very strong family, first of all. Okay, let me just say that my classmates, my family, I stay very, very connected to folks to keep myself spiritually as well as socially and psychologically uplifted. Professionally, many people are obviously familiar with Herman and obviously our dear Iris. They've been very critical to Lisa and myself, especially on the business front of stuff. I love Herman and our dear Iris to death, and they were very critical for Lisa and I, because Herman was that aspiration of that corporate person that had left in that transition, and they were very, very instrumental with Lisa and myself. So having that connection. On the side of business, okay, I'm very fortunate to be tied into the West Point ecosystem of entrepreneurs, because again, I find myself many times the only person in the room operating in the space that I'm now operating in, and many times the only business person that actually is the company in the room that's scaling and doing those things. So I do find myself being mentored a lot by those veterans that are entrepreneurs that are reaching out and helping. So based on where I'm looking to go and what I'm trying to do, always pushing myself to be with that next group of people and getting myself in the circle where I may be uncomfortable initially, but actually doing the best that I can do to add value and also to learn and then share that knowledge. Point and our place in history, contrary to what anyone may have you or want you to believe, own this story because it's your story, and know that we were there.
Absolutely. So Ron Steptoe, I just want to thank you for sharing your family story and kind of opening up about what it's like to carry a legacy and try to build a legacy for yourself. We at Do More Together are extremely proud of you, and we are keeping a close eye on everything that you do so that we can follow in your footsteps. Thank you, sir.
We love you. Appreciate you all, everybody. God bless you.
Yeah.